Welcome to another episode of the TLDR Editorial. I'm Georgina Finley, one of the writers, and I am joined today by Zach Michaelis, our ever insightful editor-in-chief.
That was very, very kind. Thank you. Yeah.
So, Zach, what have we got wrong in the last few weeks?
So I think the first thing to say is that we're supposed to do this every 2 weeks, and die-hard fans will know we haven't done this every 2 weeks. I think it's been about 6 weeks since we last did it. I don't really have an excuse. It's not great. It's a bit of a chaos here, but again, there's not really a good excuse. We should have done it more often, and we will aspire to continue to do it more often. This means this might be a slightly longer than usual video because there's more videos. Although I think, actually, I was looking through the videos, seeing which ones we made errors in, and there is like a pleasingly small number. I think that, we still do make a fair few errors, but actually I think some of the processes we put in place to catch errors have really worked. I still think there's a problem, especially with map animation errors, because they're quite hard to catch as a writer. Because when you're watching it, you're normally looking for spelling errors and checking to make sure like a map of NATO is perfect. It's just not something you do naturally or instinctively, but I think we can get better at that. But anyway, I think in general that the errors have been pretty few and far between, or at least fewer and far between than they used to be. That being said, we can sort of get straight into it. Just quickly, if anyone who's been watching this for the first time, the way we do this, we basically just go through all the videos we've released in the last 6 weeks, and anything that has a like-dislike ratio below about 96, we sort of address and see if there's anything wrong, or any video even with a slightly higher on that, but there have been some conspicuous errors. I'm going to start with the business channel, and then do probably global, and then EU, and the UK there's no errors, so we won't talk about UK.
So what have we released on business?
The one that has a lower dislike ratio, the one that I'm going to talk about, there are a couple at the very beginning of May that sort of fall between this, the last editorial, but the only one that's got a lower one is actually the most recent one, which is the Saudi Aramco one. I think there are two things that people push back on. The first, one of them is just nonsense, and one of them is sort of legitimate. The first is that in the video, I basically say that the Saudi family saw what happened when oil companies were nationalized in places like Iran and Iraq, and learned from the sort of like mistakes and the chaos. And people did point out, and I think this is true, and I think we probably should have mentioned it, that some of the chaos in places like Iran and Iraq is a consequence of sort of like Western retaliation. So lots of Western countries were not happy that their oil companies got nationalized or pushed out of those countries, and some of the issues were as a consequence of that. I don't think that's a full explanation. I think, the Iran case is a good example. There is a sort of very clear example of Western interference in the 50s when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh gets elected, and then he's literally ousted by a CIA coup. So, I mean, that's just like clear as day. And he came to power promising to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. But then, in the sort of like 70s and then post-revolution, when the Iranian oil industry is nationalized, it is mismanaged. And, some of the sort of instinct to kick out your Western managers is more than understandable, especially in those countries where it was the sort of like the companies that own those oil industries are from your former colonizers. I completely get that. And I think that's actually something that happened. That's just difference between like Iran and Saudi Arabia that we should have mentioned in the video. I was conscious of it, but I didn't have time. Which that, the Americans didn't colonize Saudi Arabia in the same way. So like when they took over, there's not as much of a sort of like, there's not a lot of political pressure to just get rid of them. So I think that's a legitimate point, and like maybe we don't make enough of the fact that there's a sort of Western interference element to that story, to why oil nationalization didn't go as smoothly as it might have done. The other point is about this thing. I think this is just bad luck, as it were, but the video got released at similar times as the story doing the rounds on like what I might describe sort of pejoratively as BRICS Twitter. BRICS is in like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And there's a story going around that as part of this like wider de-dollarization narrative, I don't know how familiar people are with that. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but basically that the Saudis were ending their dollar agreement with the US, the 50-year lease on this dollar agreement that apparently was signed in 1974 after the oil crisis, and it was mandates the Saudis to buy or to sell oil in dollars. This is just not true. It's just it's a complete fantasy. Some people think there's a secret agreement. There was no evidence of the secret agreement. It's actually just a marriage of convenience. The Saudis quite happy to sell in dollars because they were importing a lot of American stuff, especially American defense tech. So they wanted dollars. And it was the world's reserve currency, and it still is a reserve currency. So, you want dollars, you don't want anything else. I'm always very flattered though when people get angry in those comments, because the implication is that we're paid by America to have a go at the Saudis via our little YouTube channel to punish them for ditching the dollar, which is a really flattering idea. You know what I mean? And I'm sure our sort of 200k views video is going to be what changes MBS's mind. But yeah, so that was that. But I think that's the only one. The other business videos have actually been really well received, and I'm quite proud of the business content at the moment. I think it's got really nice high like-dislike ratios, and it's not our sort of natural content, but I think we've done pretty well venturing into it.
Great. So that was the business channel.
Nice.
What videos?
What a segue.
What videos are we talking about from TLDR? I mean, you picked global.
Yeah.
From the global channel.
The global channel. So I'm just going to go from the most recent video and then down, as in I'm not going to start in early May. Start with the most recent one that's got I think with the global, one of the things you have to understand is that I think actually basically as videos sort of expand out into a wider audience, then dislike ratio naturally falls, even if there's nothing wrong with them. So a lot of the videos I'm going to cover here are basically the ones that got more than 400k.
Because global's had a very good run recently. Lots of high numbers.
No, it's been good. It has been good. Thank you very much.
And there is always a stronger like-dislike, a weaker like-dislike ratio the more views you get.
Yeah, it's true.
It makes sense.
It does make sense, doesn't it? It's a very obvious mechanism. It's just that you're less of a loyal audience. But anyway, the first one is why China's falling out with the global south, which is about 95%. I think that there's nothing. So this is, I think, is partly just by virtue of the fact that it reached a wider audience, but there isn't. I don't think anything wrong with this video. So some of the complaint is about the use of the term global south. I actually just agree. I just think the global south is not a helpful turn of phrase. I think it has some utility in that, if you're speaking in very broad strokes about geopolitics, you have to use sort of generalizations and simplifications, and the global south does designate something that is a sort of it's a sort of geopolitical phenomenon. But I understand why people don't like that term. The way I think I justify using it is the fact that China really likes using it. So that's the context in which I think I'm sort of using it, is that in their press releases and in their sort of ambassadorial tweets. So one of the tweets we cite is the Chinese ambassador in that video to India, and he says the global south needs to stick together. The point there is that China is deliberately framing this as a sort of global south versus global north / global south versus America. And that framing breaks down because various countries in the so-called global south that China's talking to don't like its trade practices and are falling out with it in trade terms. Yeah, so I think that's the issue there, but I think I can justify that on those grounds. So I don't think we necessarily have anything to apologise for there. You think that's fair? I
think that's fair. I think also if you take a concept like the global south that is so wide-ranging, there will also be, anomalies or counterexamples to any examples you give from within that. And different countries will have different situations. And if you go for something, we see it on the EU channel sometimes if we talk about Europe, some trend that we're seeing across Europe, but there are regions within Europe that aren't following that trend. You also get sometimes a bit of... Yeah, and actually it's a really good point, because I think it reminded me that in the video that we do also say, I think you're right. I mean, that's one of the issues with the term global south. It's just too broad to really whenever you say something's happening in the global south, there's always a part of the global south that's the opposite's happening. But in that video, we do say that actually for, especially poor countries, like lower income countries in the global south, actually what's described as Chinese overcapacity, China exporting too much stuff, is a good thing, because if you are a poor country in Africa, or anywhere in the world for that matter, it's quite nice that solar panels have become really, really cheap. I mean, that's just a good thing from your perspective. But if you're a middle-income country, you're more anxious about protecting your domestic solar panel manufacturing industry, in which case you're a bit worried about how cheap solar panels have become thanks to China. But we do make that distinction in the video, and maybe the title is a bit broad stroke, but it's this classic issue of how clickbaity. Yeah, well, speaking about broad stroke titles, issues with titling, is there another example we have from the global channel of
We do have this is I don't know how you've read my notes, but the next one is exactly that. So the next one is why Mexico just elected the world's most left-wing president. Mm-hmm. Yeah, unsurprisingly, I agree. This is 95%. I think some of this is motivated by the fact that some of the more right-wing parts of the audience just didn't like the result in Mexico. You get a lot of people being like, this is doomed to fail sort of thing. I think AMLO's record suggests that that's not true. But anyway, it is quite hyperbolic, that title, the world's most left-wing president. I think I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, like, maybe there are other pretty left-wing presidents in South America for starters. Got Boric in Chile, for example. But it's one of those where it feels hyperbolic. I think it probably is pushing it a little bit. I think in retrospect, I might have toned down that title. What
do you think you would have toned it down to?
Something like why Mexico keeps on electing lefting presidents, something like that. Why the left keeps winning in Mexico. I think that could have worked. I don't know if it would have done as well, but I think it could have worked. But what do you think? Do you think it's too far?
I agree.
I think world's most is a bit much.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you go for the superlative, the world's most, the world's biggest, that's the end of a spectrum that you can't go any further down. If you keep to something a bit more.
I like that in this, you've become like the benchmark for credibility. I feel like I'm asking for your approval. Is that okay?
No, I agree. I think that's probably where that came from.
You're my journalistic conscience. Yeah, I think that's fair. So I apologise. I apologise for that. So again, people get annoyed when we say acknowledge. It's a terrible portmanteau of acknowledge and apologise.
Good bit of French though, portmanteau.
Portmanteau? No, I can't do that. Let's move on. Anyway, the next one, and again, I think this is just by virtue of the fact that it became quite popular. It's the Milei video. Argentina's peso collapses. Is Milei in trouble? There was some very specific criticism about it's quite complicated, but the LELICs, which are sort of they're short-term, interest-bearing, like central bank bonds, essentially, that we talk about in the video. It's not clear whether or not that's still the correct turn of phrase. They've sort of been like reformatted by Milei, or at least some of them have. But the fundamental economic dynamic that we're describing there is still apparent. And so, yeah, I don't think that's an issue. The main reason this video has a lower than usual like-dislike ratio, and the like-dislike ratio is like 91, which is really low by our standards, is just because we get a lot of Milei fans who are just furious that we're suggesting that things are going badly for him. I actually don't think we have anything to apologise in that video. I mean, the thumb is pretty hyperbolic. Has Milei crashed Argentina's economy? But it's a question, and I don't think the answer is like 100 million% no. And I think as we talk about in that video, by lots of metrics, Milei has outperformed both what people expected and what his detractors warned would happen. And we talk about that in the video, and we've talked about that in the previous video. But the declining currency was and is an issue for him. And with what's going on in Argentina, I think smart, well-versed analysts who aren't hyper-partisan on either side will tell you that it is a pretty rocky situation. He's definitely done better than people expected, but it's a very volatile economy at the moment, and it really could go either way. The politics is also very volatile. And people who think that like this is just sort of predetermined, that this like very sort of, he describes it as narco-libertarian, very sort of right-wing, libertarian economics will succeed or will fail, are just, I think, motivated by sort of ideology rather than what's actually happening in Argentina. But yeah, I don't really think there's actually much to apologise for on that one. I think I'm honestly quite proud of that video. I think we've done lots of quite economicsy videos on Global, but I'm happy to see that there is demand for that sort of content. And so I think we're just going to keep doing it.
Great.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Has Milei crashed the economy? Not too clickbaity, you don't think?
No, I think, as you said, it's a question, and our viewers will know, I think, by now that if we ask a question, our answer is not final.
It's probably normal. Listen, we always ask questions, and the answer is normally like, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't know.
Such is the state of the world and life, It's always a maybe.
Guys, free life lessons in this podcast.
Free life lessons on the editorial.
Yeah.
The philosophy of TLDR.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. Okay, fine. We're agreed there. Okay. The next one again, Saudi Arabia economy doing worse than it seems, 95. I think, again, it just reaches a wider audience. I think actually this video is sort of quite prescient. When we wrote it, there wasn't that much going on in the news about Saudi Arabia's sort of like debt woes, but they have basically issued more debt since then, and it's become increasingly apparent that the Saudi finances aren't strained in any meaningful way. It's still just a ridiculously wealthy petro state. But their attempts to reorient their economy, also rebalance it away from oil, are proving not particularly successful, and that's fair to say. This one I think is more interesting than the other ones, which is the Biden-China tariffs, which only got like 110k. So this is not because it reached a wide audience. And it's about 96, which is still high, but lower than I think we would expect. And the main issue is that in that video, I talk about, I think actually, I think I made a mistake. I say that I basically imply that globalization is good, and that economic interdependencies are good because they reduce the risk of war. So in the context of China and America, the thing that makes me anxious sometimes is that the decoupling means that there's less of an incentive not to go to war, because once your economies are sort of autarkic, once you're sort of like walled in, war doesn't really worry you, because it's not like the other country can like cut off imports or exports or whatever. And I think people push back on that because they just basically said that like the idea. For starters, I think this is a sort of partisan take from me. I mean, it's not like a partisan on a left-right divide, but it's partisan insofar as it is an opinion, and there are differing opinions and push represented both sides. So I apologise for that. But I think what's interesting is just how so much of this is framed around Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. So like I think that idea that trade interdependency does reduce the risk of war or conflict was taken to be true until quite recently. People used to throw around this fact that no two countries with McDonald's had ever gone to war with one another. But it's a trite way of saying that globalization and trade dependencies do reduce the risk of war. And I think what happened with the Ukraine thing, Russia and Ukraine thing, is that what the lesson learned there was actually, or the lesson that lots of people learned, was that actually an unbalanced dependency, when Europe is very dependent on Russia for something, actually encourages that country to go to war. And then in the same way, if I don't know what people think America is dependent on China for, but if America is dependent on Chinese manufacturers in some way, that encourages China to go to war, because they think, they're not going to defend Taiwan because they know that we can cut off their manufacturers. I think this is really interesting. I think that my instinct here is that actually the Russia-Ukraine case is a very specific case. There aren't that many countries that are economically like Russia. I mean, they're obviously petro-states, but Russia's a very, very big economy, very hard to sanction, and yet its sort of trade with Europe is very imbalanced. It just sells oil and doesn't really buy anything back from Europe. So I think that it's true in the Russia case, obviously, that the trade relationship gave Putin confidence in some sense, but I don't think that generalizes. And I think that actually I do still hold to this, like the sort of like it's a classic liberal article of faith that globalization is a good thing and that it prevents wars. And I do think there is this dangerous feedback loop where deglobalization only exacerbates fears about dependencies and encourages further deglobalization. Do you see what I mean?
So you think your implication that globalization is a good thing, whether intentional or not, and that economic interdependence is a good thing, in this video about Biden and China tariffs?
I still believe it, but I think I probably should have presented the other side. I think the other side has become more popular post-Russia and Ukraine. But I think if I was going to present the other side, I would also say that I think that Russia is a special case. Russia-Ukraine is a special case because of the very particular way that the Russian-European trade relationship is set up. And I don't think that necessarily holds true for China and the US. I think that the sort of mutual damage would be a lot larger in that case. China does rely on the US for lots of stuff. I mean, most notably, it's where it recycles its surpluses into treasuries. But that's why Neil Ferguson, who's a historian, used to talk about Chimerica, which is a terrible portmanteau.
Another one.
Which is about like the mutual dependence. There's sort of like it's called like a balance of financial terror. So like in the same way that two countries with nuclear weapons don't go to war because they both know that with mutual destruction is guaranteed, those two won't go to war because economic destruction is guaranteed in most cases. And I sort of stand by that. But I think it's a really interesting question. I'm tempted to do a full video on it at some point. But yeah.
And then you'll have plenty of opportunity to present the other side.
This is very true. There we go. Convinced me further. Last one is...
Last one on global.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was actually in Hamas's ceasefire proposal? 96. Still pretty high. I think that this is probably partly because I don't think this is actually... I think Israel content just generally has a slightly lower like-dislike ratio. I think actually it's quite... I don't want to brag, but like I think the fact that our other Israel coverage about like the war camlet stuff recently, it's all got like above 98. I think that's quite rare for Israel-Palestine coverage. You know, I think we've done pretty well to strike that balance. But this one I think is more that I think the pro-Palestine people were annoyed because I think they thought, you know, in describing the terms of Hamas' ceasefire proposal, which it isn't great, because one of the big things in there is that they basically said, we can't return enough living hostages. So when Israel said, okay, we want 30 living hostages, they said, okay, we'll do the rest of the deal. But that bit, they scrubbed it out and said 30 living or dead hostages, which obviously is not a very good offer. And I think people thought that we were being sort of, in some sense, pro-Israel in that respect. But I don't think we were. I think that's just... it's just what was in the ceasefire proposal, as it were. And I think that's come to light actually more recently. And I think there was a Hamas official who just basically said, look, we don't know where the hostages are. No one knows how many hostages are alive. And this goes back to something that I think was sort of forgotten actually. I mean, we wrote about it when October 7th happened, which was that there were reports that basically just like, not terror groups. There are other terror groups apart from Hamas operating inside Palestine. I'm not going to get into the whole question of whether or not it's a terror group or not. There are other groups within, like Hamas, operating within Palestine. There were reports that it wasn't just like terror groups picking up hostages. It was just people on bikes, just Palestinians on bikes, you know, civilians with no affiliations to groups. And that was always going to make things nearly impossible because then it's not like there's just one big repository of hostages. They're just spread out all over the place. And you saw that with that story about the hostages being kept in the Al Jazeera correspondent's house, he was a photojournalist, and he was holding a hostage. And, you know, that's just, it just makes that you can't really do a hostage deal under those terms. Anyway, that was what I think. I don't think there's anything wrong, though, in that video. Okay.
So shall we move on to TLDR EU?
Yes, I think so.
Excellent.
Lovely.
Hit me with the first one.
Okay, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go for the most recent.
Most recent, yeah.
So the most recent one is actually, I think we talked about in the office, which is the EU elections. Why did Orban and Fico underperform?
Great pronunciation.
Thank you very much. Yes, the issue here was that Ben... it's not his fault, but Ben pronounced it Fico, and that understandably irks people, especially because it's a recurring error. We really will not make that error again. I will lose my mind. Please forgive us.
Sorry.
If we do that, that would be really annoying. But hopefully that's fixed now. The other thing is that there was an error there where we said both countries' turnout was low. That's not true because Hungary held elections on the same day, held mayor or municipal elections on the same day, which meant that actually turnout was like 70%. It was really high. Slovakia was low, though, and that does, I think, partly explain the success of the Social Democratic left in that country. The next one is Gen Z Europeans. Why they're voting right. Why are you smiling at this one?
No, I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say.
This is the lowest one by quite a distance. It's got an 87% like dislike ratio, which is it's actually pretty terrible. Some of these are just errors. I'm annoyed because this video came out on a Saturday, and I normally pre-watch videos to make sure there are no errors. But I have This is not an excuse, it's an explanation. I have a newborn child, she's like 3 months old, and she woke me up at like 5, and I was like, I don't really want to watch a video now. And then I got back to sleep, and by the time
Maybe she was trying to warn you about all the errors in the video.
Yeah.
She pre-watched it, she knew.
You didn't mention immigration, Zan. I was like, shut up, Marge. Her name's not Marge, it's Margot, but I haven't named my child Marge, that'd be a disaster. It's got 87%. Some of this is just errors. We misnamed on all the animation really. We misnamed the Social Democrats in Germany as the Socialists. I think it was a copy-paste error. There was a typo suggesting 11-year-old Finns could vote. The age bracket was, instead of 18 to 44, it was 11 to 44. So, 11-year-old Finns.
That would be chaos.
Furiously right-wing, apparently.
They're not even Gen Z, they're Gen Alpha.
The Andrew Tate TikTok starts early these days. It's terrifying. And then also we presented some Flanders specific polling as Belgium wide polling when it was Flanders specific. But the main thing that people had an issue was this idea that we didn't mention immigration as a reason for why Gen Z Europeans are voting white. Maybe we should have mentioned it in the context of like why Europe is moving right generally, and maybe in sort of country specific data suggests that within specific countries, young people specifically are voting right because of immigration. But at least at the European level, European aggregate data from Eurostat suggests that immigration explains why people are moving right generally. The salience of immigration as an issue and people's sort of like positions on it has gone up and people have moved right on that issue. But it doesn't explain why young Europeans are voting right more than their older counterparts, which is what we're trying to explain in that video. And because actually the polling suggests that immigration is still less of a salient issue for young Europeans than it is for older Europeans. I hope that makes sense. And then you have to find, so that's why, to explain that trend, you have to find something that explains just why young Europeans are moving right, not why Europeans generally are. And that's why we go for some tentative fluffy stuff about TikTok and social media. Honestly, I'm not necessarily happy with the way that video ends, as it were, but that's just consequence of the fact that actually no one really knows, no one has a complete explanation for what's going on. And I agree with some of people don't really like when people just say like, oh, social media, both because it's sort of a fluffy half explanation and also because there's a sort of there's something mildly patronizing implied there. It's like young people don't actually know their own minds. They're just being convinced by Chinese bots on social media. That's not, if that is how it's interpreted, it's not intended in those terms. It's social media clearly though does have some impact on like how people think about political issues. So that's what I'd say that one. Nonetheless, I do apologize for the errors. There were some sloppy errors in there.
Another issue maybe with that one is, much like any Europe-wide topic where you try and look at a trend across the whole of the continent, there'll be a portion of the audience who come from a country where maybe that is not the case and immediately think, well, if my country hasn't been given as a counterexample, this wasn't sufficiently...
I think you're
and there's
right.
always going to be that.
And there probably will be, because the data is really, like, basically the numbers aren't dramatic. It's not like, so at the Europe-wide level, European aggregate data, it's not like old people are way more anti-immigration than young people. It's all within a couple of points. So very plausibly within that small variation, there are going to be countries where actually young people are way more anti-immigration than old people. And we probably should have dived into the data a bit more there. I guess it would have been a slightly different video, but I do take the point. But yeah, I think you're right. It's the classic issue, a bit of a generalization.
Too broad, yeah.
Too broad. I think, I apologize for that. I think it probably was a better way of doing that then.
Okay, what's next?
The most pro-China EU countries. This was just a thumb issue. It's that on the thumb, we show all of Europe and we try and give them a sort of like pro or anti-China rating. The red one's anti-China, green one's pro-China. And obviously then, like, for example, Poland was very green. I can't remember the precise thinking behind that, but then there's not representative. Poland is actually quite sort of China skeptic. And people obviously saw that thumb, thought, oh, look, my country's this color. I'll click on that. And then we only go through 6 countries. So France, Germany in the middle, and then the sort of two most China skeptic and 2 most pro-China. And so I think people were understandably irritated about that. I don't know. I think the thumb, it's difficult, the thumb thing. Maybe we should have done a different thumb. I actually think probably we should have done a different thumb. With that, if we were going to do the thumb that we did, we probably should have gone through all the countries, or maybe just put some of them in the
focus on
color.
the specific ones that were mentioned.
Yeah, you could have done like an axis, and then like this one's mentioned, go on the list, and the ones, you just leave the other ones. I don't know. But I take the point. I think that's a fair point. But that was quite low. That was 93. There's also, I think, an error on the Serbia investment. We claim that there's 10 billion euros a year last year. That feels quite high to me. And some commenters point out that doesn't seem plausible to them. It's possible that's wrong. I think there was a source there, but that might be wrong. It's worth double checking. This one will be very quick. Orban redefining NATO's membership, 95. That is because of map errors. Ireland was included in NATO, North Macedonia was excluded. We're trying our hardest to sort these out. We talked about this a second ago, but basically we have these like format, now these set maps in like a group doc where hopefully animators just copy paste and then we don't have this mistake. But yeah, that was an error. We can only apologize. Sorry. No, that's everything.
It's everything from EU. Well, that's everything in total.
That's everything in total. I had the Spain content. I was going to talk about Spain content because actually one of the Spain videos didn't do very well. I think I talked about the last editorial though. The Catalan election video we did got 97%, which is still high, but people will complain that actually it was just like a too long a history of Spanish politics. It sort of goes back to 2008, and it's like, it's talking about, it's framed as like a resurgence of the Socialists and the People's Party. I do think that actually is the correct story. I think the sort of reconsolidation of Spanish politics, especially when it comes to the Socialists, is the big story there. But understandably, people clicked on it expecting like a more of a Catalan-specific Catalan elections thing. So I think that's fair. In general, I talked about this last one. I think our Spain coverage hasn't quite been up to scratch. Trying my hardest to make amends for that, reading a lot about Spain. But yeah, I think that was at least better than the previous one, which we got better pushback for, which was about separatism being on the rise, specifically in the context of the Basque Country when Bildu. But whatever. Yeah, I think that is everything. So I think all in all, actually quite few errors for 6 weeks of content.
Yeah, I was going to ask, now that we've covered all of the specifics, what are your main takeaways, main thoughts over the last 6 weeks of content?
Have you got any main takeaways, main thoughts? You're a bit fresher to the game, so you might have some insights.
The game. I think we've done a good job as the months have gone along, as I've been here, to catch ourselves along the way.
You probably noticed the error rate falling.
I think so, yeah. But then I don't know if this is just me coming in and thinking that 2 new members of the team, we've been the difference. I don't think it is. But I think I have noticed fewer errors, fewer pronunciation errors, fewer errors in the scripts themselves.
To your credit, you've been pretty instrumental in the pronunciation issue. So Georgina speaks an absurd number of languages, and then coupled with Nadia, who also speaks a couple of languages, we've been able to cover most of the bases. And credit to the 2 of them for.
But I do think as an organisation, as a business, we have been trying to collaborate more on scripts behind the scenes before they go out, messaging each other about, if there's an issue, like, when I caught the polling thing that Portugal had as left-leaning as results as Sweden, and I messaged you, one of the animators, one of the other writers, just to make sure that.
I think also that both, I think we've started focusing on like, this is just navel gazing now, so you can click away, whatever.
No, don't click away. This is the fun. This is the free bit.
But I think that we've just started caring more about like dislike ratio, and I think partly because of the editorial, and you do see that now in writers. Like we had today, real anxiety, making sure that people sit in on the recordings to make sure that their narrator doesn't make any errors, because as a writing team, we're all worried about our videos being poorly received or getting like lower than expected like dislike ratios. Not worried in a sort of unhealthy way, but just isn't conscious of it.
And something we've discussed recently is with our titling as well. I think thinking about the like-dislike ratio as a very
this is a very good point.
As a very binary thing of people will like this or they will not like this, has helped us also steer away from titles which can be perhaps a bit sensationalist or a bit too speculative, or because if you gave a few examples of the China Global South one, perhaps, if you have that idea of a binary 2 sides, and people will, or the Hamas proposal, ceasefire proposal, if there's an idea of 2 sides that kind of will invite people to pick one over another, or, and we don't quite like get that balance, or encapsulate the nuance of the situation in the title, then that can sometimes be what produces the.
I also think to the audience's credit, like we've
dislike.
just found that actually, I think maybe the demand has changed, but with the clickbait doesn't seem to work. We've sort of, I think obviously we haven't given up on it, and there will be clickier than usual videos, and you have to have a little bit of that. But I think we've sort of recalibrated slightly. I think we went very clickbaity for a period. I think especially on EU. And I think we've sort of come back a bit, and I think we've talked about it internally, and I think we are just a bit more committed to slightly more honest titles, even if that means a short-term hit to views. And I think part of that is because we found that actually really well-received videos have a longer tail, and that even if you don't get the immediate spike, in the aggregate they tend to do better. But yeah, I'm optimistic about things.
Great to hear.
Yeah, okay. All right, I think that's enough navel gazing. Thank you very much for watching. You should actually do the outro. You hosted.
Oh, thank you very much. Wait, do I need to restart? Because
you can just go now. I mean, no one's watching.
Thank you very much for watching this episode of The Editorial. Keep up to date with all our content on our various channels. Keep an eye out for the magazine and any updates that we are promoting. Oh, sorry, wait, no.
That's fine.
No, let me restart. Sorry. Thank you very much for watching this episode of The Editorial. We were Zach Michaelis, Editor-in-Chief, and Georgina Finley, writer, and we will be back in a month's time.
No, 2 weeks.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another one.
Lovely. Thank you.
So thank you for watching / listening.
Good.